Before I start, Mr. President, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Ms. Noa Argamani, and I pay her, all hostages, living and deceased, and their families my deepest respect and support. And we grieve with all victims, their families and their loved ones. Mr. President, members of the Security Council, the Middle East today is undergoing a rapid transformation. Its scope and impact remain uncertain, but it presents a historic opportunity. The people of the region can emerge from this period with peace, security, and dignity. However, this may be our last chance to achieve the two-state solution. Mr. President, it cannot be repeated enough, nothing justifies the appalling October 7th terror attacks executed by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. And I welcome the implementation of the first phase of the ceasefire, including the release of 34 hostages. And I echo the Secretary General's condemnation of the public parading of hostages released by Hamas, including statements made under duress and the appalling display of the coffins of deceased hostages. I think none of us will forget the harrowing pictures of the coffins of the Bibas children, taken hostage with their mother and killed while in captivity. The image of Israeli hostages released show clear signs of ill treatment, reflecting the very dire conditions they were subjected to in Gaza. And I reiterate that all hostages must be released unconditionally, and while in captivity, they must be allowed to receive visits and assistance from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Mr. President, the trauma is undeniable on both sides. In Gaza, death, destruction, and multiple displacement has been inflicted upon the Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip. While the first phase of the ceasefire has provided a surge of much-needed relief, far more remains to be done over the 50 months of deprivation of basic human necessities and, above all, a loss of human dignity. In my last visit to Gaza, soon after the ceasefire came into effect, I was once again moved by a sense of utter devastation, young and old, and despair due to loss, trauma, and a sense of abandonment by the international community. As part of the ceasefire deal, Mr. President, 1,135 Palestinian prisoners and detainees have been released so far. Reports of serious ill treatment and humiliation during their detention are concerning. Mr. President, since the first phase of the ceasefire came into effect on the 19th of January, the United Nations, NGOs and member states have expedited and scaled up life-saving humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Improved access and security conditions have allowed for the delivery of assistance and services. Medical evacuations through the Rafah crossing began on the 1st of February, facilitating the transfer to Egypt of sick and injured patients in accordance with the ceasefire deal. Mr. President, the resumption of hostilities must be avoided at all cost, and I call on both sides to fully honor their commitments to the ceasefire deal and conclude negotiations for the second phase. And I commend the mediators Egypt, Qatar and the United States for their steadfast work in securing the first phase and pursuing the second phase. Mr. President, as we address the immediate needs in Gaza, we must also build a future that offers protection, recovery and reconstruction. As you know, the World Bank, EU and UN have released an updated interim rapid damage and needs assessment for Gaza's recovery and reconstruction. Initial estimates indicate that 53 billion will be required for this effort. Arab states are leading the efforts to devise a plan for the rebuilding of Gaza, with Egypt planning to host a conference dedicated to Gaza's reconstruction. The UN is ready to support reconstruction efforts. Palestinian civilians must be able to resume their lives, to rebuild and to construct their future in Gaza. There can be no question of forced displacement. Mr. President, while international attention is focused on Gaza, I am concerned about military operations, attacks and mounting violence in the West Bank. Casualties, destruction and displacement continue to be reported, particularly in Jenin, Tubas and Tulkarem governorates, where refugee camps and infrastructure are heavily impacted. Many of these areas are in Area A under the Palestinian Authority's civil and security responsibility. Israeli forces have deployed airstrikes and other heavy weaponry, whilst Palestinian militants have used improvised explosive devices and carried out shooting attacks. This takes place alongside continued violence and intimidation by Israeli settlers against Palestinians and attacks by Palestinians against Israelis. Following the detonation of 3 bombs on empty buses near Tel Aviv in a suspected terror attack, the IDF has increased its troop presence in the West Bank. I'm alarmed by the killing of a pregnant woman and young children during these operations. These incidents must be thoroughly investigated and those responsible held to account. Mr. President, regarding continued illegal settlement activity, approximately 2,000 new housing units have been advanced in recent weeks, mostly in Area C. State land declarations and settler outposts impede Palestinian land use for farming, while demolitions and evictions have been accelerated. Severe moving restrictions continue to paralyze daily life for many Palestinians, hindering access to essential services and economic activity. These developments, along with continued calls for annexation, present an existential threat to the prospect of a viable and independent Palestinian state and thereby the two-state solution. Mr. President, Israeli legislation that bans UNRWA from operating in Israel and occupied East Jerusalem took effect on the 30th of January 2025. The Secretary General has condemned the breach of inviolability of the United Nations premises in occupied East Jerusalem. UNRWA's work remains essential and must be allowed to continue unimpeded. Mr. President, the Palestinian Authority, as has been reported, continues to implement agreed-upon reforms, including fiscal and public finance policy, governance and rule of law, for the investment climate and basic service provision. In early February, the Palestinian Authority issued a decree cancelling financial payments to the families of Palestinians killed or imprisoned following attacks on Israelis. This represents an important step in the Palestinian Authority's reform agenda, and it should be fully implemented. Mr. President, turning briefly to the region, in Lebanon, the election of the president and formation of the new government provide an opportunity to fully empower state institutions in laying the foundation for greater stability, to extend state authority, and address the country's multifaceted challenges. And I call upon Lebanon and Israel to uphold their commitments upon the cessation of hostilities and undertake meaningful steps towards the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701, to restore stability and allow the people on both sides of the blue line to return home. In southwest Syria, the UN is concerned by violations of the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement, and I urge the parties to uphold their obligations under the agreement. Mr. President, since assuming the role of Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process ad interim, my team and I have actively engaged with all relevant parties. I've initiated consultations in the region and will continue to engage with key stakeholders. These consultations have reaffirmed there is no sustainable resolution to the current war or wider conflict that is not fundamentally political. As we engage in planning for Gaza's future, we need to ensure, 1, Gaza remains an integral part of a future Palestinian state. 2, Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, are unified politically, economically, and administratively. 3, there will be no long-term IDF presence in Gaza, and Israel's legitimate security concerns are addressed. We need to commit to ending the occupation and a final resolution of the conflict based on UN resolutions, international law, and previous agreements. I would like to make 4 key requests. First, continued support for the full realization of the ceasefire deal, including the release of all hostages. This is critical. Second, it is crucial not to lose sight of the dangerous dynamics in the West Bank and urgent de-escalation which is needed. Third, the international community must continue to support the Palestinian Authority in its reform efforts and its resumption of responsibilities in the Gaza Strip. Palestinian security forces should also be empowered to carry out their responsibilities in areas under their control. Fourth, politically and financially support Gaza's recovery and reconstruction effort. Mr. President, peace in the Middle East is possible. We can achieve a future where a safe and secure Israel exists, alongside a viable and independent Palestinian state. This requires continued concerted efforts, dedication, and political courage by all parties. The United Nations will continue to play its role in pursuit of lasting peace. Thank you.
President, and I'd like to start by thanking Acting Special Coordinator Karg for her briefing, also Mr. Levy, and I extend special thanks to Noah Argamani for the courage you have shown, the kindness you showed to Ela and Emily, and the bravery sharing your story with us today. I echo the remarks of Coordinator Karg in support of the remaining hostages and extend our condolences to those who mourn the dead and the missing. We welcome the return of hostages during Phase 1 after an appalling ordeal, and we call for the release of all the remaining hostages, including Avinatan Or, who also has links to the UK. We mourn the death of Oded Lifshitz, who had strong links to the UK, and we strongly condemn the vile killing of the Bibas family and the lack of dignity provided to deceased hostages. We support all work, all efforts to hold to account Hamas, the PIJ, and other terrorists who kidnapped so many innocents on the 7th of October. And I recall that this Council has called for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages in all 4 of our resolutions since the 7th of October, and I repeat that call today. The ceasefire agreement reached on the 16th of January marked a crucial first step towards ending the devastation and suffering in Gaza and achieving a sustainable peace. We're calling for 3 things. First, Palestinian civilians should be able to return home and rebuild their lives. The people of Gaza have suffered unimaginable horrors, with over 46,000 people killed and homes and lives destroyed. The UK supports regional efforts to cohere around a single plan for the next phase and reconstruction in Gaza. These plans should be Palestinian-led, with the PA front and centre, along with a strong role for civil society. Second, we welcome the improvement in aid supplies since the ceasefire agreement. But make no mistake, the humanitarian situation remains dire. We still need to see a sustained increase in the volume and types of goods reaching civilians, especially shelter and medical items. There can be no backsliding on this. We call for an urgent update to the dual-use list to allow essential supplies in and for commercial deliveries to be reinstated. The ceasefire has demonstrated the central role of the UN and humanitarian actors, including UNRWA. However, the humanitarian space is tightening, with ongoing visa restrictions and legislative proposals impacting NGOs. So we call on Israel to continue to work with the UN and partners to ensure aid reaches people in need. Third, the UK is seriously concerned at the expansion of Israel's operations, killing and displacing civilians in the West Bank. We recognise Israel's right to defend itself, but it must show restraint and ensure its conduct is proportionate. Restrictions on Palestinian movement in the West Bank are excessive. These fuel further instability and jeopardise the prospects for long-term peace. President, in conclusion, we urge all parties to sustain the ceasefire deal, implement the agreement in full, and support efforts to move to phase 2. For the hostages and their families, for Gazan civilians, and for all the Israeli and Palestinian people who deserve a peaceful and secure future on the basis of a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative UK for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her comprehensive briefing. I think it was a grim, rather grave picture that she presented. She spoke of trauma, the fragility of the situation, and what she termed as perhaps a last chance for a two-state solution. And we think that your 4 key requests merit full support of this Council. We have also carefully noted the observations made by the CSO briefers. Human suffering, power asymmetry, root causes, occupation, apartheid, international law, and accountability were the key words there. Mr. President, the war in Gaza has brought an unfathomable human tragedy. Over 47,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, have been killed. More than 90% of Gaza's infrastructure, homes, businesses, hospitals, and places of worship has been reduced to rubble. This is not just destruction. It is an assault on an entire people's existence. The scale of suffering demands not just our sympathy, but decisive action. After 15 months of relentless killing and devastation, the ceasefire brokered by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States offers a fleeting moment of relief. Pakistan welcomes this diplomatic breakthrough and commends the mediators. Yet we must not mistake this pause in violence for peace. The situation remains precarious. Delay in releasing Palestinian prisoners risks derailing the process, prolonging suffering and undermining trust in future agreements. The ceasefire must be honored in full and must lead to a permanent cessation of hostilities. But even if the guns have fallen silent in Gaza, a deeper crisis persists. Peace cannot take root as long as Israel's actions in the occupied West Bank continue with impunity. Over 50,000 Palestinians have been forcibly displaced, the largest mass expulsion since 1967. Military raids, settler violence, and illegal land annexations intensify daily. These are not isolated incidents, but part of a deliberate strategy to erase Palestinian identity from their own land. It is ethnic cleansing in real time. If this Council is serious about peace, it should ensure that the ceasefire extends beyond Gaza to all occupied Palestinian territories. To move beyond this perpetual cycle of violence and destruction, the international community must prioritize the pursuit of a just and lasting peace. In our view, it should entail the following. First, full and immediate implementation of the ceasefire, ensuring a permanent cessation of hostilities, Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, unrestricted humanitarian access, and a comprehensive reconstruction plan for Gaza, which will need to be supported by the international community and led and owned by the Palestinians. Pakistan fully supports the call for the enforcement of this Council's Resolution 2735. A ceasefire that does not lead to a sustainable peace will only delay the next catastrophe. Second, an end to Israel's aggression in the West Bank. The destruction of refugee camps in Jenin, Tulkarem, Nur al-Shams, and Al-Farah mirrors the devastation in Gaza. Forced displacements and illegal annexations must be reversed in line with Resolutions 2720 and 2334 of this Council. The legal and historical status of Al-Haram al-Sharif, Al-Aqsa Mosque must be upheld. It is clear that stability cannot be achieved through continued occupation and oppression. Third, UNRWA must be allowed to operate without obstruction. Israel has a legal duty under Article 2.5 of the UN Charter to facilitate its work. General Assembly's Resolution 79232 reinforces this obligation and condemns all attempts to hinder humanitarian aid. The deliberate targeting of aid agencies is a moral outrage and a violation of international law. Humanitarian relief cannot be allowed to be weaponized. Fourth, we must revive a credible, irreversible political process that leads to the establishment of a Palestinian state. Full UN membership for Palestine is not a symbolic gesture. It is a legal and moral imperative. The June conference, to be co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, presents an important opportunity for peace that must be seized and fully supported by all of us through concrete actions and support for the Palestinian Authority. And let us be clear, peace cannot and must not be allowed to be dictated by the occupier. It must be grounded in justice, international law, and the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. The upcoming Emergency Arab League Summit in Cairo, to be followed by the OIC Foreign Ministers meeting in Jeddah, are expected to provide crucial guidance on addressing the dire situation in Gaza and the broader Palestinian question. Leaders will reaffirm solidarity with Palestine and send a resolute message rejecting any attempts to forcibly displace the Palestinian people or alter the status of the occupied territories. This Council must continue to stand firmly against forced displacement and annexation. A just peace demands more than diplomatic declarations. It requires enforcement, accountability, a rejection of impunity, and pressure on the occupying power to comply with UN resolutions and international legitimacy. The right of return for Palestinian refugees and the realization of a sovereign, independent, and contiguous Palestine are not mere aspirations, they are the foundation of any lasting peace in the region. Within this broader struggle for justice, we must also keep in mind the human suffering, as we have also heard today. We cannot forget the thousands of Palestinian prisoners languishing in Israeli custody, arbitrarily detained, tortured, and held in inhumane conditions. They suffer in silence. Some have perished due to mistreatment and medical neglect. These are war crimes. The world cannot afford selective morality. Double standards on human rights only embolden injustice and perpetuate the conflict. Israel's illegal occupation of the Arab territories is at the core of the turmoil in the Middle East. Full implementation of this Council's resolutions with regard to Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine is imperative for a just and lasting peace in the region. Pakistan stands resolutely with the Palestinian people in their rightful struggle for self-determination, freedom, and statehood. A sovereign, independent, and contiguous state of Palestine based on pre-1967 borders with Al-Quds Al-Sharif as its capital is not just a political necessity, it is a moral imperative. If we truly believe in the UN Charter principles, if we stand for justice, for the rule of law, for the fundamental right of all peoples to live in dignity, then we must act. Justice for Palestine cannot wait. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we would like to thank the ad interim special coordinator for the Middle East peace process, Ms. Sigrid Kaag. We thank her for a detailed briefing on the situation in the region. And we listened very carefully to Daniel Levy and to Noor Argamani. What happened on the 7th of October 2023 and thereafter in Israel and in the Gaza Strip has created a completely new level of cruelty and a disproportional reaction to it. The death in captivity of 2 Israeli children whose bodies were last week transferred to their families in Israel leave indifferent. No one who believes that the human life is priceless. And we are shocked by the death of 17,000 Palestinian children who were killed in Gaza during the escalation of the conflict. In January, Russia initiated a special meeting of Security Council on children in the light of what is happening in the Strip. Tens of thousands of children in the Strip were wounded or are missing. The children in Gaza continue suffering from a lack of humanitarian assistance, hunger, and disease. And behind each of these episodes, there is a huge human tragedy. We send our condolences to the families and loved ones of all children whose lives were lost in this horrible and absolutely unnecessary conflict. We grieve not just for them, but also of all those who have fallen in the course of this escalation. Cruelty should not beget cruelty. This endless and vicious circle of violence must end. Mr. President, many responsible members of the Council, including Russia, for the long 15 months of the conflict have tried to stop it and obtain a ceasefire. Because of the position taken by the Biden administration, which aligned itself with Israel in everything, we haven't been able to do this for a long time. And it was only not 19th of January this year that we saw a glimmer of hope when finally an agreement came into effect between Israel and Hamas. The fact that they were just about to be obtained was something that the American mediators kept telling us since the moment the Security Council Resolution 2735 passed in last June. At the same time, they kept members of the Council from passing any outcome or signal which could have accelerated the process. The long-awaited ceasefire in Gaza resulted in the release of the first hostages, including a Russian national, Mr. Trufanov, and the release of the Palestinians detained in Israel. This deal also unblocked the humanitarian assistance, all those suffering and needy, and opened the opportunity for upscaling the supplies. But those were the only reasons for joy and optimism. As we're nearing the end of the first phase, the concerns grow about its further implementation. We increasingly hear from both sides mutual accusations and violations of bad faith in the implementation of individual steps. At the same time, the opaque unfortunately could lead, obviously, to a stalling of efforts and creates a risk of destabilization and fresh violence. Mr. President, we should not allow the situation to develop by itself and allow the war parties on both sides of this conflict. And we count in this context also on a consistent stance of the new American administration, whose involvement at the final stage resulted in tangible steps. It's important to avoid any kind of provocation steps, both by the Israeli and Palestinian radicals, who can once again derail this process that came into being with such difficulty. In this context, we have growing concern about the continued crisis surrounding UNRWA, which entered a new acute stage after the Knesset laws, which violate Security Council resolutions, which ban the functioning of the agency on some sovereign territory of Israel. Taking the key role this body plays in humanitarian operations on the ground and comprehensive assistance to the Palestinians, undermining their work will worsen an already dire situation for the people in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. UNRWA doesn't have an alternative, and implementing its task in case it's dismantled, the occupying power, Israel, would have to take them up. Nor should we forget the role that the agency plays in the Middle East settlement, in particular in the context of dealing with one of the key final status issues, namely the issue of Palestinian refugees. Mr. President, I think everyone understands that without the relaunching of a comprehensive peace settlement process on the basis of recognized international decisions, the region will continue teetering on the brink of a major war. We are, of course, certainly not diminishing the importance of sensitive agreements, but limiting ourselves to just that is not something that we should be doing, nor should we be proposing the decisions which are infringing the interest of one party and prioritizing the concerns of the other. It's important also to take into account the interests of all countries in the region and the key players who can contribute towards durable, lasting, and sustainable peace in the Middle East region. The Security Council, as a primary body to maintain international peace and security, also should consider the situation in the region not only through the lens of the most recent escalation in Gaza. We should not close eyes to the military operation by Israel in the West Bank, which is being conducted using heavy weaponry. Another dangerous destabilizing step here is a widening of the occupation area in the Syrian Golan Heights in Lebanon and the bans on the movement and return of the IDPs. Also, such obvious provocation as a combat overfly during the funeral of the Hezbollah Secretary General Nasrallah in Beirut. Furthermore, we shouldn't ignore the irresponsible statements made by politicians in West Jerusalem who are trying to claim that the deal wasn't there to have a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, and try to find a way out of an unprecedented and most serious crisis, but only to make sure that the Israeli hostages are returned. We, for our part, confirm our position of principle for making the ceasefire in Gaza a permanent and sustainable one, leading to the release of all hostages and detainees. We advocate a speediest possible return to the peace process on the recognized basis of having two states. We are convinced that without a just and lasting settlement, ensuring the legitimate hopes and aspirations of the Palestinians for their own state, we will not be able to spare the Middle East from new outbreaks of violence. And we do hope that this lesson has been very well and truly drawn by those who are working on further regional initiatives on the basis on the fragile but very important ceasefire in Gaza. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation, and I'll give the floor to the representative.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the Special Coordinator, Mrs. Sigrid Kaag, for her sober and insightful briefing. We also listened attentively to the representatives of civil society. situation in the occupied Palestinian territories remains a source of grave concern, despite the reduction of violence observed in Gaza following the ceasefire agreement in January. Yet, the situation continues to be volatile, with ongoing oppression and escalating tensions in the West Bank. Without hope for a political horizon or a durable solution, the suffering of the Palestinian people may persist indefinitely. In this context, I would like to highlight the following key points. First, the ceasefire agreement must be fully implemented. This agreement provided a crucial window for the delivery of humanitarian aid. It allowed the people of Gaza to experience a temporary reprieve from unthinkable hardship. Algeria calls on all parties to uphold their commitments under the ceasefire agreement and adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law. The ceasefire must be maintained in line with Resolution 2735, which emphasizes that the ceasefire will continue as long as negotiations are ongoing, and that the mediators will work to ensure these negotiations continue until all agreements are reached. For us, the return to hostilities is unacceptable. For us, the ceasefire must also be extended to the West Bank. Second, the destruction in Gaza is catastrophic, and the suffering of Palestinians continue even in the relative calm of recent weeks. The scale of needs is immense, and it requires a coordinated international response. A comprehensive plan for reconstruction is indispensable to ensure that Gaza recovers, to ensure that the Palestinian people remain on their ancestral land. In this regard, the role of United Nations agency, especially UNRWA, is essential in providing the necessary support and resources for this monumental task. Third, having implemented its scorched earth policy in Gaza, the Israeli occupying power is now turning its focus to the West Bank, where the level of destruction, where the level of settler violence is alarmingly high, particularly in Tulkarem, in Jenin, and in Tobaz. This is coupled with aggressive settlement expansion and the daily demolition of Palestinian homes. it is clear that Israeli politicians are actively inciting violence in the West Bank to serve internal political agendas. Israeli finance minister declared that our goal for 2025 is to demolish more than what Palestinians are building in the West Bank. This is a direct assault on the prospect of peace and stability, on the prospect of the two-state solution. Fourth, the weakening of the Palestinian Authority is a dangerous path that threatens the very existence of the Palestinian national prospect, of the Palestinian national project. It is a deliberate strategy by the Israeli occupying power, which dreams of a land free of Palestinians, from the river to the sea. In this context, Algeria condemns the Israeli recent decision to seize $90 million of Palestinian tax revenues. This move further undermines the ability of the Palestinian Authority to govern and to fulfill its responsibilities. Algeria firmly believes that the Palestinian Authority must be empowered to carry out its duty across all occupying territories. Only by strengthening Palestinian legitimate governance can we pave the way for sustainable peace. Mr. President, for Algeria, there are no double standards. Every innocent life must be protected. This principle lies at the heart of international humanitarian law, which safeguards civilians, particularly women and children, during armed conflict. We believe in justice that knows no boundaries. No one is above the law, and no one should be granted impunity. It is imperative to establish an international commission to investigate all allegations related to the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. Every innocent life lost must be thoroughly and independently investigated. And those responsible, whoever they are, must be held accountable. Nearly 18,000 children have been killed in Gaza. Do they deserve independent investigation and accountability? More than 8,000 innocent women have been killed in Gaza. Do they deserve independent investigation and accountability? Over 1,000 health workers have been killed in Gaza while performing their duties. Do they deserve independent investigation and accountability? More than 200 journalists have been killed in Gaza. Do they deserve independent investigation and accountability? Accountability and justice are essential to prevent the repetition of such horrors. To those who believe that the ceasefire ended the suffering of the people in Gaza, I say, you are mistaken. Just yesterday, 5 newborn babies froze to death in a hospital in Gaza City. This is cruel. It is unacceptable. And it will remain forever a stain in the conscience of humanity. Mr. President, the Palestinian people will not forget their land. The Palestinian people will not relinquish their right, and they will not cease their struggle for freedom. Occupation will never be accepted. Abnormal situations can never be normalized. Therefore, the international community must address the root cause of the suffering, I mean, the illegal occupation. And the ceasefire agreement should serve as the foundation of a comprehensive and durable peace plan under international law. We have no more time to waste. The ruling of the ICG and the General Assembly resolution ES 1024 are clear. The Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories should be brought to an end. The international meeting to be held next June is an opportunity that we must seize for an irreversible path toward the establishment of a Palestinian state in the boundaries of June 67. As President Abdelmajid Tebboune rightly stated, and I quote, "It is our duty to unite our efforts, to reinforce our resolve, and to ensure that Palestinians attain their rightful reality promised to them by international law in full and without conditions." End of quote. This reality is the establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital. I thank you, Mr. President.
The Representative France.
Mr. President, I thank the Special Coordinator and Mr. Levy for their briefings. I also thank Ms. Noa Argamani for speaking to us. France was quite moved and deeply saddened at seeing the remains of Shiri Bibas and her 2 children, Ariel and Kefir, as well as that of Odette Lifshitz. France extends its sincere condolences to their families and to their loved ones, and we were outraged to learn that Hamas initially had not returned the body of Shiri Bibas to her loved ones. That is an unspeakable act. France reiterates its unwavering solidarity with the families of all the hostages. We are thinking in particular of the loved ones of our compatriot Ohad Yahalomi, who is still being detained, and we stand with the Israeli terrorist attacks committed by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023, which we have condemned. This is the worst anti-Semitic attack and massacre since the Shoah. France will continue to act tirelessly to ensure the release of all hostages. The maintenance of a ceasefire. France calls on the parties to fully respect the ceasefire agreement after many months of shelling and civilian victims in Gaza. Discussions on the extension must begin, and the flow of humanitarian aid must be ramped up, and the displaced must be able to return home. France supports the efforts of the US, Qatar, and Egypt to facilitate talks. In support of the ceasefire, France has deployed specialized personnel to the Rafah crossing point within the framework of UBAM Rafah. Access to the Gaza Strip must be ensured by Israel for humanitarian actors, and their work must be facilitated in accordance with IHL. We reiterate our support for the essential action of UNRWA and of all humanitarian actors. The situation in the West Bank is quite disturbing. France calls on the Israeli authorities to show greater restraint and to comply with international humanitarian law and ensure the protection of the civilian population. The settlements are illegal, and settlement activity must end. And the violence carried out by settlers must also end as well. Mr. President, it is time for the Council to take up the issue of the future of the Gaza Strip and its reconstruction. We condemn any forced displacement of the Palestinian population. This would run counter to international law, and it would be dangerous for stability in the region. We support Egypt's efforts and the efforts of the Arab group to draft a plan for the day after and for the rebuilding of Gaza. The Palestinian Authority must be able to govern throughout the Palestinian territories. Hamas cannot be part of the solution. The future of Gaza cannot be delinked from a comprehensive political settlement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. France recalls its commitment to the irreversible process of an effective implementation of the two-state solution with security guarantees for Israelis and Palestinians. This is the only way to ensure just and lasting peace. With that in mind, France will co-chair in June 2025 with Saudi Arabia an international conference for the implementation of the two-state solution here in New York. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France, and I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Mr. President, thank you, Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag and Daniel Levy, for your briefings. And the United States wants to especially thank Noah Argamani for coming here today to provide such compelling testimony to the depravity of Hamas and what you endured. The United States stands with you and with all hostages, and we join other members of this council who have expressed condolences for those who lost loved ones, and to demand the release of those still in captivity, including your partner. At the outset, it is important to note that the United States continues our work with Qatar and Egypt to ensure full implementation of the ceasefire and hostage release deal. The depth of Hamas's cruelty knows no ends, and we are appalled and horrified by their desecration of the remains of Shiri Bibas. This is a gruesome scene, and we join the people of Israel in mourning the loss of several members of the Bibas family. Kefir was not even a year old when he was taken, along with his 4-year-old brother, Ariel. They were cruelly murdered by Hamas. We also mourn the loss of Odette Lifshitz, a lifelong peace activist whose remains were also returned to Israel. The only solace is that the remains can be returned to their families for proper burial. Despite the squalid conditions in which he was held, we are glad that American citizen Sagai Dekel-Hen was released after nearly 500 days in captivity. That said, we must never forget the lives taken as a result of the brutal Hamas terrorist attack on October 7, 2023, and the horrors endured by countless innocent people in the war that followed as a result of Hamas's actions. Hamas still holds 63 hostages, including New Jersey native Edan Alexander, and the remains of 4 Americans murdered by Hamas in Gaza. The taking of hostages is a despicable, criminal act. All hostages must be released now. Mr. President, as President Trump has made clear, the future of Gaza must look different. We cannot rely on the tired ideas of the past and expect better results. Bold thinking is needed to avoid ending up in the exact same place, death, destruction, and instability, which is untenable for Israelis, Palestinians, and the region. We have seen Hamas cynically weaponize the suffering of Palestinians by using civilian infrastructure to store caches of weapons, house fighters, and coordinate attacks. As long as Hamas stands as a force that can govern, or as a force that can administer, or as a force that can threaten by use of violence, peace becomes impossible. Hamas must be eliminated. It must be eradicated. Any plan for reconstruction in Gaza must ensure Hamas is fully removed from power and held accountable for its October 7th terrorist massacre. We look forward to a plan from our Arab partners on the future of Gaza that reflects this vision. Mr. President, as Israel continues to balance its safety and security requirements, we recognize its efforts to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. We urge countries to support this effort through additional funding to scale up much-needed aid. The United States reiterates, UNRWA is not and never has been the only option for providing humanitarian assistance in Gaza. UNRWA's work has been tainted and its credibility called into question due to the terrorist ties of its staff that were exposed during the October 7th attack. It was Israel's sovereign decision to close UNRWA's offices in Jerusalem based on conditions on the ground. Other UN agencies can and have done this work with appropriate safeguards to ensure assistance is not diverted, looted, or misused by terrorist groups. Turning to the wider region, Mr. President, we must acknowledge the Middle East continues to suffer from the nefarious influence of Iran, which continues to sow chaos. Behind every terrorist group like Hamas, behind every act of violence, behind every destabilizing activity, behind everything that threatens peace and stability for the millions of people who call this region home, is Iran. The United States will not allow Iran to manufacture or acquire nuclear weapons, through which the regime would seek to render itself immune from external pressure. As the result of the ceasefire, the countries of the Middle East have an historic opportunity to reshape their region in a way that affords its people a better path forward. An expansion of the Abraham Accords can lead to greater regional integration between Israel and its neighbors in a unified bloc to counter Iran and its state sponsorship of terror in Gaza, the West Bank, and throughout the region. The United States will do its part to create a more prosperous future for all of the region's people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the U.S. for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of China. Colleagues, I thank Ms. Kag, the Special Coordinator at Interim for the briefing, and thank Mr. Levy for the statement. Ms. Agamani, thank you also for your briefing. I express my deep sympathy for your ordeal. The 15-month-long conflict has caused unimaginable suffering to civilians of both Palestine and Israel. We sincerely hope that all detainees will be released and reunited with their families as soon as possible, and that the 2 million conflict survivors in Gaza will not be plunged into war again. Thus, the Gaza ceasefire agreement must be fully and continuously implemented to ensure a permanent ceasefire. We are gravely concerned about the recent frequent violations of the ceasefire agreement and strongly call on parties concerned to fully implement the ceasefire agreement. In particular, the provisions on access of humanitarian aid and release of detainees, among others, must be implemented strictly, seriously, and in good faith. In this process, the dignity of all, including the deceased, should be respected. Negotiations on the second phase have been deferred. The international community should encourage and support the parties in moving ahead with the negotiations as soon as possible. Countries with major influence on parties, in particular, should play a role to that end. The massive Israeli attacks on the West Bank has lasted over a month, creating the largest displacement of Palestinians since 1967. Israel has also indicated it will maintain a long-term military presence in the West Bank. The situation continues to escalate. The developments are worrying. War must not be reignited in the West Bank. West Bank must not become the next Gaza. China calls on Israel to stop its military operations in the West Bank, cease the settlement expansion, and curb settler and calls on all parties to work together for early de-escalation of the situation. Colleagues, the fundamental crux of the decades-old Palestinian issue lies in the failure to implement the two-state solution and to establish an independent state of Palestine. Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, are all inalienable parts of the state of Palestine and the homeland of the Palestinian people, not bargaining chips for political deal-making. The post-war governance of Gaza must follow the principle of Palestinians administrate Palestine. The international community should provide support for the reconstruction of Gaza. The role of UNRWA in the humanitarian relief and post-war reconstruction of Gaza is irreplaceable, and its normal mandate delivery must be guaranteed. We call on the international community to step up its efforts to advance the political process of the two-state solution and to provide necessary guarantees to that end. Along with the international community, China will continue our unremitting efforts to restore peace in the Middle East and to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the question of Palestine. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I'll give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
You have the floor.
To the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
You have the floor.
Mr. President, we thank you for convening this meeting at this critical time. We also express our thanks to Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her presentation and efforts, and Daniel Levy for his important briefing. We also acknowledge the presence and testimony of Noah Argamani and echo her calls for honoring the ceasefire. Mr. President, Israel's plan is clear in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, and in the rest of the West Bank. Get rid of Palestinian demography to seize Palestinian geography. It has this recurrent dream that it will end this conflict through the disappearance of the Palestinian people. That will never happen. It will not happen. We have often repeated, there is not a people too many in the Middle East. There is an independent state missing. The failed recipes of the past will never deliver a different future. Our history is filled with wars that Israel promised will be decisive, and they were not. Of mass forcible displacement that was supposed to end the Palestine question, and it did not. The idea that more injustice, more brutality, more oppression would lead to peace is madness. The idea that more killing, more maiming, more displacing will bring security is delusional. There is no military solution to this conflict, only a political one. As we sit here and speak, on the ground, Israel is trying to make sure that political solution, the only one that leads to peace, is not viable anymore. It is destroying the two-state solution in the hope to make its unlawful annexation of Palestinian land permanent. It continues entertaining the idea of emptying the Gaza Strip of its people through so-called voluntary migration, the code name for mass forcible displacement. It is conducting a large-scale military assault against the Palestinian people in the West Bank, notably against refugee camps, which has led to the largest displacement of Palestinian population there since 1967, with over 40,000 Palestinians displaced, and now stating it will not allow their return and intends to stay there for a year. While the Arab world are trying to find a way out of the hell Israel left behind in Gaza, Israel is unleashing hell in the West Bank. When we speak of the utter and wanton destruction of Gaza, of human tragedy and people's ordeal, of the devastation, of how Gaza was made unlivable, let us not forget Israel's responsibility as it deliberately spread destruction across all of Gaza with the very purpose of making it unlivable. Mr. President, there is only one way forward. Preserve the ceasefire in Gaza and ensure its full implementation in line with Council Resolution 2735, and end the escalation and aggression in the West Bank, leading to a permanent cessation of hostility. Ceasefire has to be permanent. Reconstruction of Gaza while its people remain in Gaza, and while they participate and benefit from such reconstruction. The Palestinian government assumes its full responsibilities throughout the OPT and should be enabled and supported in this endeavor. A cessation of all the policies that entrench the occupation and conflict instead of ending them. Ending the occupation, achieving the independence of the State of Palestine, and implementing the two-state solution. Mr. President, enough bloodshed, enough agony, enough suffering. Let me repeat that. Enough bloodshed, enough agony, enough suffering. Israel has killed at least 50,000 Palestinians, maimed, displaced, arbitrarily arrested, tortured, and caused suffering for millions of Palestinians. Our children have been killed, amputated, orphaned, displaced, traumatized. This has to stop. It has to stop. We have seen in recent days another attempt by the Israeli government at dehumanizing the Palestinian people as a whole and at justifying the killing of our children. There can be no justification for harming children, for harming all children from everywhere. Israel killed thousands of Palestinian children, often in atrocious conditions. Liane Hamada, 15 years old, was with her mother, father, her 3 siblings, and her cousin in a car, evacuating from Gaza City in the morning. She called emergency services after her parents and her siblings were shot dead. And I quote, "They are shooting at us," she screamed. "They are shooting at us. The tank is next to me. We are inside the car, and the tank is next to us."
الو مرحبا الدبابة جنبي انتوا متخبيين؟ في السيارة احنا جنبينا الدبابة انتوا جوا السيارة؟
Here is the recording as you heard it, her call. After this salvo of bullets, Liane went quiet. A few moments later, her 6-year-old cousin, Hind Rajab, picked up the phone. Let me show you her picture. She said to the dispatcher, "They are dead. I am in the car. The tank is next to me. It is moving. It is very, very close and moving. Talk to me. When someone can you hang up? Please come take me, please. It's almost night. The night is approaching. I am scared. Please come, take me." Listen to the voice of Hind Rajab and imagine her agony and the agony of her family and of thousands upon thousands of Palestinian families.
ميتين؟ وهم هلا معك بالسيارة؟ هذا جنبية. الدبابة وين؟ جنبية. الدبابة جنبكم؟ عم تتحرك ولا واقفة؟ نزل حدا منها؟ هي بتتحرك. تتحرك؟ طيب هي بتتحرك جنب السيارة ولا هي جاية من ورا السيارة أو من قدام السيارة؟ من قدام السيارة. هي جاية عليكي من قدام السيارة الدبابة؟ قريب كتير؟ كتير. وعم تمشي؟ طيب ما بدنا نخاف. خليكي معي. أنا معك يا عمري. أنا معك. أنا معك ليجي حدا ياخدك، ما بدي أسيبك لحالك. لما يجي حدا بتفصل إيه؟ لما يجي حدا يكون هي بتفصلي. لا أنا بدي أتمني معاكي.
I will stay with you to make sure you're okay. Stay with me, stay with me. Oh, sweetheart, I'm here with you. I will not leave you alone. Come, take me.
The dispatcher stayed on the phone with her, trying to reassure her, God will protect us, playing, counting games. The Palestinian Red Crescent sent an ambulance with 2 emergency respondents, Yusuf Zino and Ahmed Al-Madhoun, to rescue her. They never made it. It took 12 days till rescue teams were able to reach the area. They found the 2 members of the rescue team dead, and they found Hind, her aunt, her uncle, her 4 cousins, all dead. Our children deserve compassion and solidarity. They deserve compassion and solidarity. They are born into a terrible reality, and one generation after another fall victim to it. They are not less deserving of your outrage for their killing and their inhumane treatment. All families are entitled to dignified burial of their loved ones, all of them. And as you assert this principle, remember the images of Palestinian mothers and fathers collecting what remained of the bodies of their children in plastic bags, or carrying their corpses while being displaced for miles. Remember the thousands that remained under the rubble because we were not allowed to rescue them. Remember the hundreds of Palestinians' corpses still detained by Israel. When Israel decides to delay the release of hundreds of prisoners, including women and children, that is collective punishment. Israel has abducted thousands of civilians, and they were subjected to inhumane treatment and then released or disappeared. Did you see the images of our released prisoners? Often starved, with marks and scars on their bodies. Did you know Israel subjected them to beating before their release, or to humiliating and degrading treatment, and makes them wear clothes with provocative slogans on them and film them? Or these images never made it to you? Have you seen them? I'm sure you did. Israel considers these kinds of actions, all these actions, as normal and justified. Aren't all Palestinians presumed guilty by Israel? Do you? As my friend from Algeria said, no double standards. If you care about humanities and international law, don't exclude the Palestinians. Be fair. Deal with everyone, especially the children. Be fair. Justice does not serve only one group of people and ignore other children. It serves all of them. It is always strange to see Israeli officials who have called for unjustified genocide speak of the need for de-radicalization. The most extremist views are out there in the public sphere, including that Palestinians do not exist or do not deserve to exist, that raping and torturing prisoners is justified, that starving Palestinian civilians is morally justified, that all our children are guilty. And these are not only theoretical views. Israel is acting upon them. And if it is the one committing the action, it is no longer barbarism. To the contrary, it is the only to safeguard civilization. This is a narrative that countries in these halls know well, a narrative to justify the oppression of entire nations. Mr. President, what we need is not more violence. It is to break the cycle of violence. That's what we need. We can always find justification for revenge, but will it ever solve the problem? We owe it to our peoples, to our children, to end this conflict, not find reasons to continue perpetuating it. All children deserve to live in freedom and dignity and security. All children. We have repeated many times how important it was to be consistent. The rules of humanity and legality do not change with nationality, religion, or race. Human dignity should always be preserved, and civilians should always be protected, not killed, not paraded, not ill-treated. The sanctity of human life should be respected, and the respect owed to the dead should be honored. We reject all actions that run counter to these principles. As we ask you to know the stories of our children and to remember their names, we offer our condolences to the Bibas family. Nothing justifies what happened to Kfer and Ariel Bibas or their mother, Sherry. They should have been safe in their homes with their families, as our children should be safe in their home with their family. Challenge those to repeat the sentiment of humanity that we have, if they have any of it. We are collectively failing them, failing to offer the protection they deserve, failing to stop the suffering, failing to offer a different future. In Gaza, the loss of children and the loss experienced by children can barely be grasped. What they need now is not further uncertainty, but the knowledge that the world will be by their side. Mr. President, we said from the first day this assault will be against the Palestinian people as a whole. Through indiscriminate killing and wanton destruction, we said only a ceasefire can allow Palestinian and Israeli families to be reunited in life, can allow to put an end to the mass starvation of Palestinians, can allow to stop the effort for their forcible displacement. We said that Israel's goal was the remains annexation, and that after Gaza, Israel will intensify its assault on the West Bank. How many hostages were released in military actions, and how many hundreds of Palestinians have perished in these military attacks that were supposed to rescue the hostages, but led to the death of many of them? And how many hostages have been released through ceasefire agreements? Ceasefire works. Ceasefire saves lives. For the US, the conclusion of this agreement and its implementation is about the hostages. But for Israel, was it? The next few days yet again test its true priorities. Will they destroy the ceasefire and resume fighting? Or will all of you, will all of us make the ceasefire permanent to save lives? Mr. President, the fate of our people is not to be killed and be displaced and be occupied and oppressed. No people would accept such a fate. Help us to demonstrate to our people that there is a peaceful path that leads to freedom and justice and peace. Palestinians and Israelis are not destined to be eternally at war. Peace is possible. Peace is possible. And after all this suffering, peace is indispensable. It is indispensable. It is imperative. We need it. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Thank you.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Special Coordinator Kach, for your briefing. Today marks a historic and deeply emotional moment. For the first time, a freed hostage has shared her story before this council. Noa Argamani is not just a witness or a victim of Hamas's cruelty, she is a survivor. With unimaginable bravery and dignity, she has endured the unthinkable and emerged to speak for those who still cannot. Noa, we are honored by your presence, and we are praying every day for the safe return of your partner, Avinatan Or, and the 62 other hostages who remain in captivity. Noa, we thank you. We thank you for your courage, for your voice, and for speaking here today for those who cannot. But Noa should not have to be here today. She should not have to relive her trauma before this council, nor should she have to remind the world of what Hamas is. And yet, here she is, because for months, so many around the world and on this council have chosen to look away. Colleagues, it is time to finally pass a resolution here in this room to unequivocally condemn Hamas and designate it as a terrorist organization. It should have happened 16 months ago. I appreciated your words, Mr. Mansour, about the Bivas family, but still, you are not capable of saying the word Hamas in your speeches. You are ignoring it. In order to move forward, you have to acknowledge that Hamas will not be part of the equation. If they will be there, all your wishes will be lost. After Noa's testimony, I'm not sure how anyone in this room could possibly object to such a resolution. We have heard many times in this chamber doubts raised about our determination efforts. I am sure we will hear it again. However, there is no longer any need to justify why Hamas must be eradicated. The truth is undeniable. Hamas is a terrorist organization that slaughters, tortures, and kidnaps civilians. So Israel will continue to act. We will not be deterred. We will eliminate Hamas. Believe me when I say it. We will bring our people home, and we will secure the safety and future of Israel. Today, when you look at Noa sitting here in this chamber, remember the story behind the face you saw on that motorcycle. Remember the months she spent hidden from the world. Remember Yossi Sharabi and Itai Svirsky, who died beside her. Remember Avinatan Or, who still waits in the dark to be brought into the light. This is not simply Noa's story. It is a story of every hostage and every family shattered by Hamas's terror. It is a story that will not end until each one of them is back home. The question now is whether this Council will help write that ending or continue to look away. For months, Hamas has psychologically tortured and toyed with families desperate for answers. They have released hostage lists at last possible moment, forcing families into a cycle of unbearable uncertainty. They refuse to provide the Red Cross with access to the captives, leaving parents to go to sleep each night not knowing whether their children are dead or alive. And worst of all, they have played with the hostages themselves. You have heard, Noah, forcing them into their despicable theater of cruelty. Every time hostages are released, Hamas stages a sickening and vile ceremony designed to prolong the suffering of those still held captive. Just this past Saturday, those monsters forced Eviatar David and Guy Gilboa Dalal to watch one of these ceremonies from inside a van that brought them to the site. As they pleaded for their own release, their captors took every opportunity to prolong their sufferings. It is not a political strategy. It is a calculated, sadistic manipulation of human suffering. Nowhere has the cruelty been more evident than with the Bibas family. For over 500 days, Israelis and so many around the world, and many of you, have asked yourselves the same question. Is the Bibas family still alive? Those two beautiful boys? Now we know the answer. Hamas didn't just murder Ariel and Kfir. They slaughtered them in the most deprived way imaginable. They didn't shoot Kfir. They didn't shoot Ariel. They killed them with their bare hands. These monsters looked into the eyes of a 9-month-old baby and his 4-year-old brother and strangled, beat, twisted, and shattered them with their hands. One would imagine that there is nothing more sickening than this atrocity. Somehow there is. To hide their crime, they mutilated their tiny bodies to make it seem as though they died in an airstrike. This is Hamas. This is who they are in their souls: child murderers, butchers. And still, this council hesitates. Still, we hear statements that draw a parallel between Israel and Hamas, as though this is a symmetrical conflict. It's not. On one side, there are families holding on to hope. On the other side, there is an organization that murders infants and holds onto their bodies until it serves a political and propaganda purpose. Believe me, no matter what happens, our commitment to freeing all the hostages and completely eradicating Hamas is unshakable. We have heard endless discussions about humanitarian efforts in Gaza. You are all aware of the thousands of trucks entering Gaza every week, thousands, delivering aid. You have also all seen the videos, those grotesque parades during the release of the hostages and the return of their bodies. And in those very videos, the truth is clear. There is no starvation among Hamas, nor among the civilian population. The only starved people in Gaza are the hostages. We have seen their emaciated faces, their frail bodies, the undeniable evidence of months of deprivation. However, unimaginable suffering is clearly not worth the time of many on this council. Mr. President, tomorrow we will bury the bodies of Ariel, Kfir, and Shiri Bibas. Yarden Bibas' family is gone. The nation of Israel will come to a stop. We will escort the bodies of Ariel, Kfir, and Shiri to their final resting places. For months, Yarden endured unimaginable agony, unsure if his wife and children were alive, all while suffering in Hamas's hands. Now, thanks God, he is back in Israel, but his torment continues. Instead of captivity, he faces an unbearable silence. Where his wife and children should be, there is nothing. Hamas has lost any right or chance to be involved in the future of Gaza. The world has seen, through the story of Noah Argamani, the stories of Kfir and Ariel Bivas, and the stories of countless others, the extent of their cruelty. For the sake of the hostages, their families, and all those who truly seek peace, in this room, in Israel, in Gaza, it is time to let go of past conceptions. It is time to think beyond the frameworks of the past and build a new reality, one where terrorists do not hold entire communities hostage and where life is sacred once more. The path forward requires courage and imagination, out-of-the-box thinking, free of past conceptions and status quos. It also requires the Council to stand united against Hamas's tactics of terror and manipulation. To be able to build a better future, you must lay a solid foundation, a moral foundation. There is no avoiding the fact that this foundation requires a basic resolution condemning Hamas for their atrocities. I will not drop this issue. I will continue to remind you of your failing until it is finally corrected. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement.